Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the channel for the race review of the Mexican Grand Prix 2025. And obviously, I discussed it in my preview video, but I had very low expectations for this race. I wasn't particularly excited for it, other than the top three in the championship, of course, that narrative. But it actually kind of delivered for once. I'll give it credit. It wasn't the best race of this season or even in recent years, but for Mexico City standards, it was pretty good. And there's quite a lot to discuss, so let's get cracking, dive straight in to some of the highlights. And I think a big contentious talking point this weekend has been the sort of corner cutting track limits shenanigans. Um, Most prominently on lap one, but also with the Hamilton Verstappen incident on lap six, I believe. And if I'm honest, I think it is something that needs to be sorted by the FIA because I think the two best examples to give are Charles Leclerc and Max Verstappen on lap one, where I think Max Verstappen's is somewhat reasonable because it's the same as any track, his sort of incident where he didn't really have any space to go. It was just the nature that the Ferraris kept squeezing him into the side and he had to go off track. I think if the Ferraris gave him a bit more space and were a bit further to the right, Verstappen would have gone for that corner. I don't think he went into that with the intention of going off. His car just bottomed out because he was on the curb and there was no grip. However, Charles Leclerc, it's ridiculous that he's managed to keep that. It honestly is because Hamilton did everything right. He just stayed on the inside, stayed on track. Same with George Russell behind. But Charles Leclerc's just like, you know what? I'm gonna cut this corner, take the lead, give it back to Norris, and I'll happily take my P2. And I just don't get how, like, it wasn't even questioned at all. Because he has just literally cut the corner for I know he lost control of his car a little bit, but that's not really an excuse when he was on the inside line. He had space around the outside. He could have slowed down to make the corner, but he just decided to bail because it was quicker and keep the position ahead of his teammate. And ultimately, that is what gave him P2, because if he didn't do that, Verstappen would have beaten him on raw pace. And I think George Russell was going a bit on his sort of like diva arc that race. And I do think he was moaning a little too much about the turn one stuff. But I do think having some sort of gravel trap there in future years, or at least in the middle part of it. So if you do what Verstappen did, for example, have like a tarmac road that goes around the outside, I think that's fine. But I think you need to have a gravel trap in between the main sections of those bits so that you can't just cut it and gain time. At least if there's a gravel trap, you probably will get underfloor damage too if you take it too quickly. So there is a sort of penalty to doing it. But at the moment, you can just cut the corner and have no real downside, which is exactly what Charles Leclerc did. And I think another incident at turn one that happened was Liam Lawson and Carlos Sainz, I believe, making contact. And again, I think Lawson said in his post-race interview that Sainz literally just decided to bail, but didn't look that Lawson was around his outside. And after watching the onboard, I do have to say that kind of looks like the case. They were very squeezed, like there was a big group of cars where they were, and Sainz just decided to go off track and then just clattered into the front wing of Lawson. And I think it's just too appealing for the drivers to go for this off track cutting. Like, there's no real downside, and I think that's what the FIA need to do. Do I think they do that with penalties? no, because it's always a slippery slope. Um, because I think the best example this year is you take Jeddah turn one, for example, where Max Verstappen cut it to keep the lead. I think corners like that need to have more of a deterrent for cutting it. Because, like, the thing is, you want it to be the case where if the driver is having a bad corner, they can't just bail out of it. They have to commit to having a bad corner and lose positions because of that. Because if Charles Leclerc stayed on track, Hamilton probably would have got ahead of him. Russell could have had a chance, and it's just not particularly fair on the people who stayed on track, and I do agree with that. But I think penalties aren't necessarily the way to go about it because it does kind of just ruin the racing. I just think it needs to be more of a deterrent, whether that's bringing the barrier slightly closer, um, or like I said, gravel trap is probably the best solution. But I think it just kind of shows the clownery that the FIA is sometimes. Because the fact that, like I said, the Charles Leclerc incident was barely even talked about, and the excuse of there being teammates. I mean, that's ridiculous. If Charles Leclerc goes steaming into the side of Lewis Hamilton, are you really telling me that the FIA aren't going to investigate that? Like, because they're teammates. That's just not the case, or it shouldn't be the case if it is. So I think it really exposes that change needs to happen on tracks like this, um, or turn ones like this. But the only sort of saving grace of that is it did make it exciting at least. Even though it might not be particularly fair, at least you have drivers going for it in turn one rather than just tucking back in and being conservative. And speaking of going off track, I think Max Verstappen fans, like, holy, every onboard of him this weekend, I swear, it looked like he was just going to stack it in the barriers. Like, his car control needs to be talked about more because his, well, he himself called it rallying at turn one. How did he keep that out the barriers? Go and watch the onboard right now. He is full counterlock and still on the throttle and nearly hits the barrier, but manages to avoid it. Like, it's insane. And every time he went through that turn sort of 7, 8, 9 sequence, every onboard, especially in qualifying, but also in the race, he's having snaps of oversteer through there at what is nearly a full throttle section. And I'm just like, holy, if you're a fan of him, how are you not having a heart attack every time? Because I genuinely thought he was going to be out quite a few times this weekend, but somehow his car control just manages to catch on to it and still be fast. It's crazy. But speaking of a moment where he nearly lost it, is when Behrman shot up into P3 briefly, and I think that's an incredible drive from Behrman. I mean, obviously, you'd say that him finishing P4 and a Haas, but I think the true thing that was impressive about it is that he did actually have the pace to stay there, and that is kind of backed up by the fact that Esteban's finished in ninth. I know that's a long way off of where Behrman was, but it shows that the Haas car did actually have pace this weekend, and he genuinely was a match for the Mercedes. Like, George Russell with this whole little moaning about Kimi Antonelli letting him through, when Russell had fresh tyres and he was ahead and had clean air, he literally made no dent on Behrman. Like, literally, they had equal opportunity there, and he did nothing. The only person who was faster than him below was Oscar Piastri, who we'll talk about it in a bit. If not for the VFC, probably would have had a chance to get P4. But I just think it's really impressive that he's managed to hold on to this pace and it was legitimate because in free practice, he did have signs of being quite quick. Like, if you paid attention to that, I think it would have been a good shout to say Behrman has a chance of doing a good weekend. but I don't think anyone really expected him to actually have this level of pace. And the only thing I will say about it is I am slightly confused about the hitting him. Like, I I don't know. I think if they left him out, because he had fresher tires than Verstappen, right? And he didn't really make much of a dent. And I think it was kind of um touch and go whether Max Verstappen, well, Max would have caught up to him for sure, but I think Behrman also would have had a chance to catch up to Charles Leclerc because he had, like, both of them had a chance to get to that Ferrari because Charles Leclerc's pace at the end was not great. It was good for what he had, for what his tyres were, but it was definitely beatable if they at least tried it. So I was quite surprised to see him pit like so abruptly. I mean, I know he had to pit quickly to cover off I think Oscar Piastri and Antonelli behind, but I don't know. I think it would have been interesting to see if he did stay out. As a matter of fact, all of those drivers, if all of those drivers stayed out, because Max Verstappen, it looked easy, and it's easy to say that the one stop was great for him, but that is because everyone pit out of his way. I don't know what that would have looked like because they were all in a DRS train, right? So it's hard to say if Verstappen would have found it so easy to cruise up on Charles Leclerc if all of those people committed to the one stop. Because if all of them commit to the one stop, I think Behrman has a chance of finishing third. Um, but no, they all just kind of parted the seas for Max Verstappen, and he just went through and nearly got Charles Leclerc at the end. And unfortunately, that got rid of the first podium for Behrman. But I think a P4, the team's best result or joint best result in history, I think you take that every day of the week, and I believe it takes them ahead of Sauber in the constructors. So for Haas, a pretty great weekend. Like you couldn't really ask much more. I mean, double points. Say what you will about this whole season, where I think Esteban Ocon has been really underwhelming. I know he has good points, but it's kind of the same conversation as Lance Stroll's points, where he had some really fortunate big points earlier in the season, but it wasn't really on pure merit. And I think having both of them in the points really shows how decent the upgrades on that Haas are and how Esteban's actually doing a better job this weekend. I know he got knocked out, but he was very close to going through to Q3 and made a nice recovery to P9. I mean, can't ask for too much more from him, to be honest. I don't think he really had a chance of beating everyone ahead of him, eighth up. So it's a pretty great weekend from Haas, I'd say. And of course, the last sort of main talking point, I'd say, is the oh my God, the VSC at the end. I I despair with the FIA sometimes. I say sometimes, quite often, really. If I urge everyone to go online now and watch where Carlos Sainz's car was when they pulled that VSC out, and I think you'll agree with me that it's absolutely ridiculous. I don't know what they're on about because you can't help but just compare two incidents that happened, right? Look at the first couple laps. There's no VSC. They send two marshals onto the track, and Liam Lawson nearly hits both of them because there's no VSC, right? And then you contrast that to Carlos Sainz at the end, who's very much out of the way of the track, and the marshals aren't in any danger, and neither are the drivers, and yet they decide we're gonna chuck a VSC for this, and it just ruined the end of the race. Like it would have been so exciting to see Max versus Leclerc for this podium, and furthermore Piastri versus Behrman for P4. But no, we just have to watch on the VSC for what was really long as well. Like, if they really wanted to throw a VSC, right, I can kind of accept that if it was literally like 30 seconds, because that's all it really would have taken are the barriers. But no, it lasted for like a lap and a half, or half a lap. And it's like, how? How? I genuinely don't get it. And it did really like take the sting or take the bite out of the end of this race. And it's really unfortunate because it would have been so entertaining. What more do you want as an F1 fan than a last lap battle for a meaningful position? Like, we were truly robbed, but I don't think that should detract from the overall race we had because I think the rest of the race did kind of make up for it. And fortunately, it wasn't a stinker beforehand. Because if it was a bad race before this happened, this would go down as one of the worst Mexico Grand Prix ever. Because, like, it just completely ruined the ending. But that's all for sort of like the race weekend highlights, I'd say. So now I'll go on to my Rawesome Driver of the weekend, um, who I think is kind of a class of one this weekend, if you think about it sort of unbiased wise, because like there is some emotional reasons to put other drivers, but I think from an objective standpoint, it has to be Lando Norris. Like again, similar to what I said about Verstappen last week, you can't help but not give it to Norris because what triple purple sectors in qualifying, fastest by like 3/10, I think. Never really looked in doubt either and then goes on to the race, has a good turn one lap one, and just rockets into the distance, very 2023 Verstappen-esque. And like I said, it never looked in doubt. Like he comfortably had this weekend wrapped up, and as I alluded to in my preview, it just is a Lando Norris track. I don't really know why, but he always does well here. So to anyone who doesn't want him as world champion, I wouldn't see this as a necessarily like ominous thing as he's gonna sweep all of the last races now and that the McLaren's really OP. I don't think that's the case, but I do think it showcases that he is very good at this track and it kind of was expected to happen, right? Like he just looked dominant even in practice. Like you kind of expected this the whole weekend. So I think it's a very well deserved Rawson driver for Norris, and hopefully he continues this sort of form into the next few races. I will allude to the fact that we have obviously Vegas in 2 rounds' time, and that is not a good track, or has not been a good track for McLaren. So if he has a good race at Vegas, I'd say he has a very, very, very good chance of winning the championship this year, especially with the fact that Piastri hasn't been so good at, well, he hasn't been amazing at Brazil and Vegas coming up. So I think eyes look on Verstappen now, arguably for the next two races, against Norris, that is. But ultimately, a very, very good weekend from him. And I will briefly mention the two honorable mentions I have for Rawson Driver. Firstly, very unsurprisingly, Ollie Behrman. As I mentioned previously, I won't go too much into this, but very good drive. I think what P9 to P4, I think. What more do you want? Very good. And then my other sort of not necessarily under the radar pick, but I think deserves more talk is Gabriel Bortoleto. Again, P16 to P10 in a Sauber that didn't look overly competitive this weekend. I think he's done the maximum he could have. And yes, he probably wouldn't have finished in the points if Yuki Tsunoda didn't get screwed over by his Red Bull pit stop. Either way, it would have still been a P11. And I think for a driver that struggled a lot last weekend and wasn't so great in Singapore, I think this is a really strong weekend for him. And just shows those other two tracks obviously weren't a liking to him. Like he's still having an incredible rookie season and delivers when he needs to. I mean, I know Sauber lost the position in the Constructors' Championship, but he at least gave them an extra point to stay closer to Haas for the coming races. Um, but with the Rawesome Driver sealed up, it naturally leads on to the extinct driver of the weekend. And to be honest, I think this was a tricky one because there wasn't really a single driver that did anything terrible. So unfortunately, it just kind of led me to go for the high profile mistake of Lewis Hamilton, I'm afraid. And I know on paper it looks worse than it was, where you look at it and it's like P3 to P8. That's not great. And of course, that's all because of his 10-second penalty. And lightly speaking on the penalty, I do think it was deserved. And I know it wasn't given for him not using the rejoin thing. And just again, briefly, that rejoin track is so stupid. Like, I don't know what they're expecting because it's almost perpendicular to rejoining to the main track. So, like, if someone does do that on low grip and comes in the proper position, that's just going to cause an incident if there's cars nearby. Like, somebody's going to have to avoid him because he's not exactly going to park it and then go to the inside line. He's going to have to rejoin on the racing line. So I don't really know what they're expecting with that runoff thing. The issue obviously was that he supposedly overtook off track, and didn't give the lasting advantage back. And I do think that is reasonable, and I think it's unfortunate that I've given this to Hamilton himself, because I do think a large proportion of that is Ferrari, because it was a contentious thing, right? And it was quite obvious Ferrari didn't have the pace to, tank a 10-second penalty and be like, you know what, it's fine. So I think they really should have been more like, even just more considerate about that. Because it just feels like from a viewer's perspective, they didn't even like care that it was potentially going to be a penalty. They were just like, you know what, we've been done wrong, just continue. And I think that, I mean, obviously it's ruined his race. I think he definitely would have been a contender for the top 4 or 5 minimum. And I just think it's a big um mistake from a Ferrari, but also Hamilton, because he's been in the sport long enough to know that a penalty could have been given from that. So I just, there's obviously other contenders for bad drives, because you could say Carlos Sainz qualifying P7, obviously with the grid penalty, but then DNFing at the end. But I do cut him a bit of slack because he literally had a car issue and had contact at turn one that wasn't. I think it was more on him, but it also, for the rest of the race, it inhibited his ability to do something because of the damage. So I think Carlos Sainz is a close other shout for this, but you kind of need to take into account he had car issues, whereas Hamilton didn't really. It was just his own mistake and Ferrari's mistake. So yeah, I think I don't like wholeheartedly back this as him being a bad drive this week. I just think there's not any other standout terrible drives to stop it from being Hamilton. So that's my reasoning for that. And now I'll move on to a couple questions after this weekend. And the first one being, is Oscar now looking like he'll finish third in the standings? And my response to this is, I think it's quite likely. If he continues this form, as I briefly alluded to previously, where we've got Brazil, Vegas, Qatar, and Abu Dhabi coming up, I think Brazil's a pretty high average track for him. I wouldn't say he's like a standout favorite for Brazil. And then we go to Vegas, where McLaren has just not been great at Vegas. So again, I'd favor Verstappen over him there. Qatar, everyone's saying it's a McLaren track, but seemingly have obviously forgotten last year, where in a pretty bad Red Bull at that stage of the season, Verstappen won the race. Like, I don't know why people are forgetting that. And I know the gap to Norris in that race looked bigger than it was because he had the drive-through for ignoring yellow flags. But Verstappen had that race pretty comfortably to win or finish second. So I don't know why it's kind of being hyped up that's a McLaren track. I think it will be close there. And then I'd say Abu Dhabi is the only track where I'd be like, Oscar is kind of a favorite there. So considering that, and the fact that there's two sprint races at the upcoming races, I'd say it's not looking very good for him. I'd honestly put Verstappen ahead of him in 3 out of 4 of these races, and that is going to close the gap because it's 35 points between him and Verstappen. I think that's very possible Verstappen clears that because I think it's reasonable to say Verstappen might have a win in one of the next 4 races. I don't think Piastri will follow up second, and that's a 10-point swing. If he continues those point gains, he's gonna at least get second in the championship. So I think it's really worrying for Piastri because again, this weekend just completely absent. Like I see people saying he had a good recovery drive. I don't think it was. Like he gained a position in the pit stop, right, over Antonelli, so he didn't have to overtake him. And he only really made a move on George Russell. He gained a position from Hamilton because Ferrari bottled. Um, so I think it's very flattering on what he actually did that race. Most of it, he was just stuck in DRS and didn't really do much. There was never really the um, sort of chance or the decision to go for something different. They just stuck in that DRS train and got somewhat lucky that he got one of the Mercedes in the pits and then had a pretty decent chance on the other one because George Russell was just, mentally bankrupt at this point in the race. Um, so yeah, I think it's quite possible he finishes third. I think right now you have to look at Lando as the favorite. And I know that's easy to say because he's just won the race, but I would have said that in maybe not Singapore, but definitely Austin. You'd say Lando is probably the favorite now. And I just think it's shocking from Piastri, to be honest. And there's obviously all the talks of foul play at McLaren. Um, Read into that what you will, but it is very odd, this level of performance drop. Like, it is crazy that he's gone from comfortably being in the top 3 in qualifying and race to now consistently or quite comfortably being outside of the top 5 in qualifying or just barely in it, and then just not really showing much in the race. And like I said, Piastri fans, I think you need to be concerned because, yeah, he's 1 point behind in the standings, but that means nothing if Norris keeps outscoring him. So, yeah, not looking great for Piastri right now. And my next question is, will Yuki gone before Brazil? Now, this is quite a contentious one and will be proved right, obviously, in the next 2 weeks. But I think he will personally. And that's not that I say I agree with this decision, but I think you need to look at how Red Bull are going to perceive this. And they're going to look at this and see Arvid Lindblad has beaten him in FP1, right? And before everyone says anything, I know that Arvid was basically on a fast lap at the end, right? And Yuki wasn't, and that's why it's a bit flattering towards him. But the media is going to see past that, right? There's always a narrative, and it's a bit of ammunition for them to use and say, look, Arvid was quicker in FP1. We see potential in this guy. And I think, unfortunately, there was obviously that Helmut Marko statement a while ago where it was like Yuki's got up until Mexico to prove something. And I think in Red Bull's perspective, they're just going to be brutal again, I think, because they seemingly just like to ignore their own mistakes because they're going to look at this race and see Yuki in P11 and be like, "Oh, we've got such a bad second driver." But they gave him a 10-second pit stop. Like he was it's not great, but he would have finished ninth at minimum. But no, 10-second pit stop puts him into traffic, and at that point it's race over, race ruined. And I think it's a decent job that he recovered to 11th. But I think Red Bull are just going to be so ignorant and look at the objective result and be like, Verstappen finished third, Yuki finished 11th, not great. And they're just going to be like, oh, well, it might be useful to get Hadjar in the seat before 2026 so he gets used to the Red Bull. And I think I do see that as being their logic behind this, of getting Hadjar acclimatized to the Red Bull philosophy. And whether that means Yuki goes down to VCarb, or if that means Arvid somehow gets subbed in mid-season and Yuki's just completely gone. But I do see a change happening personally. And look, I'm gonna look like an idiot if this doesn't happen, of course. Um, but I think based on his results, he hasn't really had any high points. Like again, Azerbaijan was quite flattering. I don't think he really had the pace to finish there. It was more so it was a crazy qualifying, and DRS dirty air trains just are impossible to get past. So I wouldn't say there's been a single weekend where you look at Yuki and it's like, oh my God, he's been great. Because again, Austin, he had good results, but it was because of turn one. And I know that's still his skill, getting through turn one well, but ultimately it's not showing his pace. It's just showing good situational awareness. And I think if you got rid of that turn one fortune, he would have barely made the points in those races. So I'd rate it as like a 70% chance he gets subbed out before Brazil, which I don't think's fair, personally. I think at this point, you just let him finish the season, because I think it's the narrative has been really not right. It's exactly the same as what happened with Perez, where for some reason people are n knowledgeable of the fact that the Red Bull second seat has been very bad for the last years. And we've had good drivers. Like people laud up Alex Albon, right? But when he was in that Red Bull, wasn't doing very well. Same with Sergio Perez. Like now the media narrative has switched 180, where people are saying Perez was actually quite good. We were too harsh on you. But now for some reason, people are just being really harsh on Yuki when we still know the car in theory is hard for the second driver. And he didn't have preseason testing. I know he's had most of the season, but you need to compare him to what Lawson was doing at the start of the season, right? Lawson had preseason testing. We rock up in Australia and China, and the guy is qualifying P20. P20. That's terrible. And he had zero pace in any of the races. And I know it's a very low benchmark to compare against, but then you look at Yuki, and he hasn't had results as shocking as that. Yet people are saying that Lawson deserves to keep the drive over Yuki, when we conveniently forget that in 2024 and 2023, Yuki was very strong in the RB seat and was very much a match, if not better than Lawson. And people will look at the results. Yuki had some very poor luck when Lawson was subbed in. Like, I'm thinking Singapore, he got DNF'd by Checo. I'm thinking Monza, where he didn't even take the start, I think. Like, he had bad fortune in those races, but in the races that he was able to do, he was better than Lawson, and he was better than Hadjar at the beginning of the season. So I really hate how this narrative is completely switched to him being just terrible and like not doing good enough. It needs to be shifted back on the Red Bull philosophy. Like that car is just toxic, and I don't know what people expected from him. I really don't. It was obvious after the first couple of races that that seat is just chronically bad, and I don't think he can do much more. So I think he'll get swapped out. I don't agree with it, but we'll see going into Brazil. I think it's just going to be another Red Bull swapping situation. But now that my two questions are done, we're going to look at my prediction results, which are definitely not flattering to look at. As you can see, I don't claim to have wheel knowledge based off of this. I mean, I got the drivers in the top five largely right. I'll take that as a positive, but it's not great. I I'm silly because I did say Norris would have been strong this weekend in my preview, but I didn't back it enough. I don't know why. And then Piastri, obviously, like hella overrating this guy. And of course, Leclerc had to go and get second. Like, annoying, but yeah, not a good result from my qualifying predictions. And unfortunately, it doesn't look any better for my race predictions because Albon had one of the worst weekends, or just anonymous weekends in a while. Hamilton probably was looking on for a P4, but then just gets the 10-second penalty. Russell had basically zero pace compared to the top guys. And then I got the top two wrong, really, again. I know Verstappen didn't finish second, but he would have. Um, so yeah, pretty shocking from my predictions this week. The only positive is at least I got some of the right drivers. But, there's only room to improve from here. And I will come back better for the weekend in Brazil next. And obviously, my stroll of the week, yeah. I mean, I I will not be shameful in my high expectations for Lance Stroll, you know? We were, well, no, we weren't close to him qualifying 16th. I mean, he qualified 19th, but, you know, I was right that he got knocked out in Q1. That's not a hard prediction, but I was right. And then E10 was just a bit too optimistic, I suppose. There was a point in the race where he was doing all right, but then he pit and just kind of did nothing after that. So, justice for Lance Stroll. I think Aston Martin back on top next weekend. Not top of the podium, but I think they'll be good at Brazil. And hoping that Lance Stroll will have a good weekend next time. And, you know, we'll see. And then, of course, the one good prediction I had this weekend is my general prediction, which say what you will about the VSC, but thank you very much, Carlos Sainz. 4 DNFs on the money. Like, come on, we take those. It didn't really happen in the way that I thought it would be. There wasn't a single like proper crash, but you know what? 4 DNFs is 4 DNFs. I take those, and you know what? I'm happy with that. Can't ask for much more from a general prediction, and hopefully I continue the momentum into next week. And what that does to the scores is there's my scoring system at the top. It gives me 1 point for qualifying, half for the race, and then 2 points for getting that general prediction right. So that takes me a total of 3.5. And then, of course, this is the first weekend I'm doing this. So my overall is 3.5. And overall, just a pretty poor weekend from predictions. Like, pretty terrible. Hopefully better next time. But yeah, really a weekend to forget in terms of my wheel knowledge. Um, but yeah, that leads to the sort of looking forward to Brazil next time out. As you can see, championships closed up, 36 points cover the top three, and as an early prediction, well, as an early hope first, really hoping this is a rainy Brazil weekend. I mean, who doesn't want that? It's always absolute cinema when it is. Um, but if it is like that, I'm gonna put my money on Max Verstappen being competitive, top one or top two, I'm gonna say Norris is gonna be again top one, top two. Piastri probably. I mean, the gap's being so close at Brazil. I think he's gonna have a stinker in qualifying. I think he's gonna be quite bad purely because of the drivers being really close. And then my sort of out there prediction will be Mercedes will suck. There you go. That's my sort of outlook towards Brazil. I think this weekend is going to be really entertaining, as it always is. And just lots to look forward to as a Formula One fan. Like, obviously, we have the top three in the championship this close, but even though no one really cares about the constructors, it is also a somewhat interesting narrative with the battle between Haas, Racing Bulls, Aston Martin, and Sauber and Williams. That's really getting quite close. And again, is something to sort of look at this weekend. If, like I said, Aston Martin are better this weekend, they might get closer to Williams. Like, it's going to be very interesting for the context of everyone in the championship, and just going to be a great weekend. Like it always is. This track is just amazing. One of if not the best on the calendar, especially with the weather that it often has. So yeah, lots to look forward to. If Yuki is swapped in between this, then I'll try and make a video on that, if it does happen. But assuming it doesn't, I will see everyone again for my Sao Paulo preview. I hope you enjoy the video. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed. Tell me any sort of videos that you'd like to see, whether that's topical to the championship, whether that's just abstract Formula One things. Let me know. I'm very happy to give everything a go. So if you enjoyed, thank you very much, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.